On lovely day. It's always like this in Glasgow as well in November, so bear that in mind if you're planning a trip. I think I'm going to try speaking without the mic. Is that okay? Can everyone hear me? Also, I've got quite a strong accent and I tend to speak fast, so if you're not picking up, please alert me to that. Okay, I'm going to talk about stigmatised neighbourhoods and public services in particular. It's public services, schools, street sweeping, road maintenance, health centres are all very much central to all of our lives, and to neighbourhood quality in particular. But we don't tend to look at them very much as those of us who do neighbourhood research. They tend to get sort of put to the side. And poor neighbourhoods in particular are especially reliant on public services. People living in poor neighbourhoods don't tend to be able to afford membership of health clubs, so they're reliant on the local swimming pool. Their kids go to the local school. So people in disadvantaged neighbourhoods tend to be particularly reliant on poor neighbourhoods, but not mentioned very much in research. Here's a quote from one of our First Ministers, Jack McConnell, a wee while ago, where he's sort of launching an agenda in Scotland to take the quality of public services in disadvantaged neighbourhoods more seriously. And here he is saying basically, public services, when they work, they provide a springboard for citizens to lead fulfilled and happy lives. They help the strong look after the weak. They add strength to local communities. But he also says that when we don't get it right, when our public services are working badly, they can make inequality worse, and they can devastate families by failing those people who need us the most. Very strong language from a First Minister about public service provision, basically saying when we get it wrong, we are really doing some significant harm to people. And I guess that's my starting point for saying we need to take this issue more seriously. And in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, up until May of last year, and we say that phrase quite often, we were looking more seriously at the quality of public services in the neighbourhood and thinking about how we can make them contribute more effectively to changing the fortunes of those neighbourhoods. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about, do stigmatised neighbourhoods have worse public services than other kinds of places? Just a wee bit of research background on that. I'm then going to talk about this idea of using Nancy Fraser's notion of misrecognition rather than stigma. We're going to hear quite a bit about stigma today. I'm going to focus on Nancy Fraser's notion of misrecognition and think a wee bit about the nature of the discrimination that might actually happen within neighbourhoods around stigma. I'm now going to talk about my own research and work with colleagues on environmental services in particular, street sweeping and refuse collection, the sort of Cinderella services that are in the background that we all notice when they're not working. So talk quite a bit about my own research on these kinds of issues, and the last slide, which is references to further work and acknowledgements to colleagues as well. Because I'm not going to talk very much about methods and this presentation probably draws in about 3 projects. I'm not going to talk much about what we did in those projects in the short presentation, but there's details there for people who are interested to follow up. Okay, so do stigmatised neighbourhoods get poor public services? Well, lots of academic textbooks assume that they do. Looks like that. Services for poor people tend to be poor services, and the UK government back in 2001 was basically saying, yeah, it's a real problem here, poor neighbourhoods are getting the poorest services. Saying there's not been an awful lot of real detailed empirical research to say, well, is that true? There was research carried out in the United States in the 80s, in particular 70s and 80s, which came up with a rather surprising conclusion, which was that it was looking at whether public services in relation to poor black neighbourhoods were worse than other kinds of neighbourhoods, and came up with a result which suggested there wasn't a systematic bias against these kinds of neighbourhoods. The administration appeared relatively benign, politically neutral with regard to race or social class. But this research was subsequently criticised for focusing on the inputs to neighbourhoods were all neighbourhoods getting an equal share of service provision, rather than were those inputs relative to need? Were they taking account of higher levels of need in particular kinds of neighbourhoods? So it was sort of challenging that basis. The UK research has been a bit more subtle and a bit more sort of clued into those kinds of debates. Is it just one size fits all, or should some neighbourhoods be getting, because of their characteristics, be getting more services? And if they're not getting more, then is there a bias against them? The UK results basically suggest that gradually over time, over the last 20 years, and probably again up to May of last year, when we had a change of government, there's been a generally positive relationship between higher levels of need and service inputs. Been spending more in poor neighbourhoods on some public services, and that word "some" is relevant because the research also shows the quite strong variation in that field. So some public services remain pro-rich. Parks, libraries, higher education spend tend to be focused on the rich. Other services, there might be some skewing towards the poor. Social services for very obvious reasons, others more neutral. So I guess the big picture is that on this agenda we haven't really done enough research. The jury's still out, it's still a contested issue. What about the people who live in those neighbourhoods? What do they say? I think they're quite clear. They say, well, when we interact with public services, when we go to the local office and we try and get our needs met, we're treated like second-class citizens. We're treated like we're not as valuable as some other clients. The speed with which the police react to our calls is less than elsewhere. The building's a mess. It's not being maintained. Where we have to go, the local school is falling down. These kinds of things. I interviewed one woman who had been burgled on Christmas Eve, and all her Christmas presents had been stolen. And she said, basically, the police weren't sympathetic. It was almost as if she should have been expected to be burgled because she lived there. She should have taken more care. It's fairly obvious that you're going to have more in your house around about this time, so maybe you should just expect that that's going to be happening. Another woman who had been up to the school to discuss her child's progress in school. She wasn't happy with the progress the child was making. Was told by the teacher, don't worry, we don't expect them to be geniuses around here. So this idea that these people only have a limited claim on the public sector to give them a good and appropriate service, I think comes very clearly through the testimony of residents. Okay, let's go into this notion of misrecognition. There's quite a lot today about defining stigma, and I'm going to use Nancy Fraser's ideas here. She's discussing the relationship between what she calls the politics of recognition and the politics of distribution, i.e. in an economic, financial sense, distribution of who gets what. And she argues that who gets what relies on who is deemed valuable or worthy or deserving. And here's a quote from her. So she's saying, to be stigmatised or misrecognised, it's not simply to be thought ill of, looked down upon, or devalued. Misrecognition is not relayed just through free-floating cultural representations or discourses. It is perpetrated through institutionalised patterns. It is grounded in real habits, structures, realities. In other words, through the workings of social institutions, the institutions that we've made, our schools, our local council offices, whatever. And there's at the end she's saying, misrecognition constitutes a form of institutionalised subordination, and as such is a serious violation of justice. Institutionalised subordination. It's a bit like this notion of institutional racism, the idea that we can discriminate against people without even realising we're doing it. It's just part of the habit, part of the normal way of working, not a deliberate, conscious activity, but ingrained in the practices of the organisation or the culture that we're part of. And that's what Fraser's arguing here. that stigmatisation isn't just about what people say about other people. You actually find it embedded in the way in which society operates, and it affects the distribution of goods and benefits from this society. And that's sort of my argument as well in relation to public services like street sweeping, which I'll now go on to. So there's some pictures of littered, environmentally degraded housing areas. And I guess my question is, how does this come about? How does this association between a poor neighbourhood and having litter in the streets come about? And in particular, what's the role of the institutions, the public agencies who are concerned with delivering a clean environment to everybody? What's their role in that? How are they responding to stigma and producing these kinds of conditions? Okay. Well, in the UK, there is very strong evidence that poor neighbourhoods have poor levels of environmental cleanliness. You don't have to be able to read this graph to see that these are the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods and the most environmental problems. And it's a straight line down, which better off neighbourhoods fewer. And that survey, that evidence is sort of a mixture of self-reported evidence, but also external surveys carried out by other agencies as well. Okay, so how does this relationship come about, this strong relationship between disadvantage and littering, environmental degradation? Well, one of the things that we've done in the course of our research is to ask the people who provide the services to those neighbourhoods, how come? How is it like this? How has it come about? And what we find is a sort of a systematic pathologisation of neighbourhood problems, blaming the victim, blaming the people there for that degree of litter. So here's a manager saying, well, it's a social thing, it's just part of the culture. It's not been educated out of them. Street sweeper. Well, there's just some people who are scruffy bastards, that's all there is to it. And here's another manager. Well, the people are just dirty, that's all there is to it. Not a very in-depth analysis, but a very clear analysis. Well, it's not our fault, it's their fault, and it's just the way that it is. And I think this is a key way in which stigmatisation happens, these kinds of ways of thinking about neighbourhood problems, which blame the victim and emphasise behavioural explanations rather than how society structures the distribution of opportunities and benefits. So stigma isn't sort of free-floating out there, it's embedded in practices. And we see this in our research. We spoke to the people who were delivering services in different kinds of neighbourhoods. And we found that these ways of thinking about these neighbourhoods mattered for what these people, these service providers actually did. So he's a street sweeper admitting to just walking past rubbish. They're not discriminating, but it wouldn't make a difference for us to do our job properly. We just do the bare minimum. And here's a street sweeper who works between a better off and a more disadvantaged neighbourhood, contrasting his working practices in the two neighbourhoods. He'll go into people's gardens in the better off neighbourhood and remove litter from them. He would never do that in a poor neighbourhood. He works in a different kind of way in different neighbourhood contexts. And importantly, the managers would admit to this kind of activity as well. Here's one who had a real Freudian slip during an interview, basically talking about a neighbourhood which had undergone significant improvement, and basically saying, before the regeneration, we used to get away with things a wee bit, but now everyone's eyes are upon this neighbourhood. The community is calling us to account. Other people are coming to see it, so we can't get away with it anymore. Admitting to shoddy aspects. And we had other sorts of examples of this institutionalised form of discrimination against these poor neighbourhoods. When there are staff shortages and there's not enough capacity to go around, what neighbourhoods get prioritised for street sweeping in those situations? Well, it's the better off neighbourhoods. where the complaints will come in if the neighbourhood isn't kept up to standard, rather than those neighbourhoods which actually might really suffer from the street sweeper not turning up that day. Now, people don't readily admit to discriminatory practices. Quite often in our interviews, people would say, well, I don't do it, but they probably do, as important clues. But the fact that people would admit to these practices at all, I think, tells us something about the extent to which this is likely to occur. Okay, so I said that the people who work in the front line, managing, delivering these kinds of services, tend to blame the people who live there for the problems. But we also didn't just let them get away with those explanations. We sort of tried to follow up and say, well, are there other kinds of reasons for why this area is dirtier than another area? And in the course of conversations, people would volunteer, gradually, sometimes reluctantly, other kinds of explanations to do with, well, it's a much busier neighbourhood because not as many people are working, so there's always people here. Or there's a lot of young people in this neighbourhood. Street sweepers in particular will always tell you that wherever there's young people, there's more litter. It's almost like a rite of passage to drop litter in front of a street sweeper for some people. Where they also tell us, high housing density, where there's a lot of people and a lot of housing crammed in. Yeah, those places are littered as well. So what we did was that we, through the course of one of our projects, we took many of the factors that were being highlighted by the service providers and some of our own sort of hypotheses, and used a range of data sets at the national level, that sort of data which showed you that it's a problem nationally, and also at the local authority scale. And we did we did quite sophisticated statistical analysis, used regression analysis, factor analysis, to try and unpack what features of neighbourhoods make them more prone to environmental problems. And we found features like demographic features, who lives there, the age of people, child and youth density, the number of young adults, young families matters. The physical characteristics of dwellings matters. Their size, how big they are, how much space there is within them to store the old couch before when you've got a new couch. As well as density, overcrowding matters, how many people are living in the home. And also where the neighbourhood is in relation to the street layout, how it is orientated towards the wind, the tenure mix, the mix of other kinds of uses of the neighbourhood, these kinds of things. Now the key point here is that once you control for socioeconomic deprivation, these factors depress cleanliness wherever they occur. Okay, now that's very important. Some of these factors are associated with poor neighbourhoods. You get more young people in poor neighbourhoods. That's the nature of these neighbourhoods. But once you control for deprivation, once you take it out of the equation, then having these kinds of characteristics in your neighbourhood will mean you'll have more litter. So, is it the people? Is it the feckless poor who are causing these problems? Or are there underlying structures of these neighbourhoods which are making, it's not a level playing field, it makes them more prone to these problems than they would otherwise have. Having this accumulation of characteristics depresses your environmental quality, whether you're poor or you're not. Okay, so when we deliver environmental services, do we recognise this problem? Do we take account of it? Well, we did some detailed work in 3 local authorities to assess that. And we looked at expenditure on street sweeping relative to dwellings, number of dwellings, or to dwellings according to whether they were a deprived street or not. We went right down to the street level. We'd love to see this in detail. These are 3 case studies. And what that shows is that these are the most advantaged neighbourhoods, these are the most disadvantaged, and there is a bit more money being spent on street sweeping in the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods. I mentioned at the outset that in the UK we have been trying to bend the spend a bit more towards deprived neighbourhoods, and also in relation to the local environment, the big best value regime, local authorities were being monitored on how clean their streets were. So there was an incentive there to sort of improve standards and to spend a bit more on those areas that perhaps needed it most. So we were spending a bit more on our poorer neighbourhoods. But they were still tending to be dirtier than the average bowl littered. So does that mean that you can spend more but you don't really resolve the problem? Well, we wanted to, and that's the danger of spending a bit more but the problem still being there. The issue is that sufficient to address the problem? That's what's embodied in the notion of recognising needs, fully taking account of the range of factors within the neighbourhood. Is it commensurate with needs? Okay. This graph, this chart, is the blue case study at the bottom. And what we've done in this, which shows a bit more money being spent on poor neighbourhoods, what we did is we looked at the different services that were sort of underpinning that graph, the different kinds of street sweeping services. So the blue bar, that shows expenditure on programmed services per dwelling according to how deprived the street was that dwelling was located in. And it shows, and that's programmed services, that's your routine, normal service, in this case, twice weekly street sweeping. And that shows, again, most deprived at that end, less resource being spent on that basic service in more deprived neighbourhoods than in better off neighbourhoods. The red bar is responsive after the event type services. Catching up and fly tipping, responding to complaints, unusual circumstances. And it shows that there is more resource being spent in deprived neighbourhoods on those kinds of services relative to better off neighbourhoods. Now in total, there is almost 30% more resource being spent in more deprived neighbourhoods than the least. But a bigger proportion of that is being spent on these after the event catch-up services. And the cost per job is much higher, and we calculated that as well. So the actual work getting done for the money is less. But the bigger issue here is, well, why do these poor neighbourhoods need more responsive services? What's going on? And part of the story clearly is because they're getting less of the basic, normal, everyday programme services. But how come? I said before, each street in this authority gets swept twice a week. It's a standardised, one-size-fits-all service. It shouldn't happen like that. But to understand that, we need to look at the relative workloads of the people providing that service. So what we did was that we calculated the workloads of all the street sweepers in this authority, the number of dwellings and the street length that they had to service. And we divided the workloads into whether they had high workloads, medium workloads, or low workloads. And this is what we found. Again, most deprived neighbourhoods at the end. Heavy workloads are the yellow bar. More than half of the streets in deprived neighbourhoods were serviced by a street sweeper who had a heavy workload, who had more dwellings and more street length to service than the fifth of the street sweepers working in the least deprived neighbourhoods. So you can see that there's capacity being built into the workload model, which allows street sweeping in better off neighbourhoods, street sweepers in better off neighbourhoods to have more time to do the job diligently. Now we can talk at length about the social processes which had led to that. We presented this information back to the local authority. They had never had it sort of proved to them before, but they had suspected it. They had suspected that some people in better off neighbourhoods, some street sweepers, were on an easier wicket. And it was to do with being responsive to complaints and therefore adjusting workload capacities gradually and incrementally over time. There was stuff around people knowing their MP and playing golf with their councillor, and just that gradual incremental building up of capacity over time in better off neighbourhoods and taking it away from worse off neighbourhoods. I think this is the effect of stigma. It's the hidden, institutionalised preference for serving the needs of the better off, which we're not always aware of. This chart shows you that, I mentioned before that we measure outcomes, and we did measure outcomes, we measured cleanliness levels in all sorts of neighbourhoods. And that shows, blue case study again, it shows you that better off neighbourhoods, this is a sort of threshold, they were scoring above the threshold, in excess of the threshold required to report back to government. I'm now going to focus on the pink case study. And there you can see the outcomes are a wee bit flatter. They're not going right up above the threshold, they're hovering round about the threshold. And here thinking about how can you break this link between how you're thought of and what you get. There's the pink study again, the case study. More's being spent in deprived neighbourhoods. Yep, money's going up, and also there's more equal outcomes. Like the blue case study, I'm only going to focus on the blue case study and the pink case study because both the services are the same in those two authorities. Every street's swept twice a week by a person, a guy with a barrow and a broom. The green case study is a wee bit different. So the same as the blue case study, more's being spent. We did the same thing with this case study. We looked at the workload issue. Here's the pink case study. Here you can see that more than half of the most deprived streets are serviced by a street sweeper who has a low workload. Contrast it completely with the other case study, the blue case study, where it's the opposite. More than half the streets there were serviced by a person with a heavy workload. It's almost the reverse. So what's going on here? Well, what this case study, what the managers in the pink case study had done, was that they were distinguishing between apparent and actual workloads. Apparent workloads refer to the number of dwellings or street lines serviced. That's what it looks like on paper. But the actual workload, the actual need for work in that, takes account of the differing level of challenge within that neighbourhood. Number of young people, the busyness of the area, where it is, these kinds of things. And in this case study, as a response to this best value regime and to get their scores up, they had deliberately gone out to engineer workloads to reflect needs. They've gone out and done that, and it shows that it can be done, and the outcomes were largely equal. So you can break the link, or can you? There's just one last wee twist to the story. So in both of these cases, services appear very similar to the layperson. The frequency of the service, the fact that it's not done with a wee machine, but it's done by a person. The blue case study, however, there was hidden targeting of affluent streets. And in the pink case study, there was hidden targeting of deprived streets, just by shifting around workloads. Thinking about stigma, I think there's a case for thinking that both of these are a response to stigma, but they're both a case for, they're both still a case of misrecognition. A case of the institutionalisation of a sense that some people are more worthy than others. So how am I saying that? Particularly about pink. It should be obvious about blue. So Fraser, back to this idea of misrecognition. How we think about poor neighbourhoods has real practical effects. How a neighbourhood is valued affects what they get, and the blue case study, I think, demonstrates that. So stigma is not just a way of talking about people, it's part of the way in which we actually live and we practice and we deliver services. I think the pink case study demonstrates that you can redistribute your resources. Managers can spend more money in poor areas. But is it full recognition of these areas? What I haven't told you about the pink case study, I said it was led by managers. It was a managerial agenda. The public in this local authority doesn't know what's going on. They don't know that built into workloads is this extra capacity to work better and to work more thoroughly in deprived areas. Local politicians don't really know that it's going on either. It's kept under the radar. It's just how they divvy up the work in this authority without it becoming a politicised issue. And the managers are doing it partly because some of them are really interested in social justice, but also it's a way of driving up their scores. So I guess what I'm saying here is that is that still a case of misrecognition? Because it's not going public and saying these places need more. It's our responsibility to make sure they get more. It's a much more difficult, nebulous process where we aren't quite admitting to it. Now, could we have a world in which it was possible to say, look, these kind of places need more, they've got more children, have got higher housing density, and it's not a level playing field, so we should spend appropriate to needs in that area. They need more help. Well, yes, you think we could have that kind of world, but resources are finite. They're shrinking dramatically. And spending more in these neighbourhoods means spending less somewhere else, and that's the rub. That's the difficulty. We have a defensive middle class who are very protective of their quality of their environment or quality of their school or whatever. Very difficult politically to take away from them. And in a sense you can also say there's maybe a misrecognition going on there as well, amongst those people who are doing quite well, thank you, a misrecognition that their needs actually should be addressed and valuable, and that that therefore they shouldn't lose out when we're thinking about more equity. I think stigmatisation is part of the deep structure of social relations. It's not just something which we can talk about in isolation. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've got the last slide there, which is some references to our stuff, which if anyone's interested in following up, they can.